put your question, and then after your question is answered, then you'll free to comment.
So we're looking at 3 applications for SH to get through the variation plan change. So, and your report refers to Red Hills at para 13. What are the other 2?
The other 2 are Wainui and Belfield.
Sorry?
Wainui and Belfield Road in Papakura.
Belfield. I mean, Mr Chair, I won't be supporting this resolution, and it's more of a matter of principle for me. I think that the Hashar legislation has been so cynically gamed. I think that there are people in our community who are affected by SHAs on their boundary, who need to have an input and who have not had an input. And the whole notion of the Housing Accord, I understand, is to speed up and increase the supply of housing to address a crisis, real or perceived, and I think it is a real crisis. But I think that the process for addressing that has been to compromise the rights of affected people in their community to have their say about developments that affect them. And as someone who is very concerned about private property rights, I am very uncomfortable about that. I think that, and it was set out in paragraph 11, that the extension to the Act was to, the amendment to the Act was to respond to high demand outside the Auckland area. But the reason why the Hashar legislation was developed to bring benefit was to speed up process, in effect, by truncating the process of community input. That's what this is all about, and I think that that is not to the credit of the decision makers who designed this legislation, or indeed necessarily to this council for endorsing it. Because when you look at it, has it necessarily allowed a whole lot of new SHAs to proceed, thus increasing the supply of housing? Well, maybe it has, but not to the extent that I think some people would have liked. And I think the reason for that is I think there have been people who have gone through this SHA process for the purpose of increasing the value of their land holdings, but not necessarily to increase the supply of housing. And that's a pretty cynical process that they have gone through, aided and abetted by the fact this legislation is in place and that this housing accord has been signed. Am I prepared to sign up to truncating the effects of an SHA on adjacent property owners, and for those property owners to be able to have an input through a proper process? No, I'm not prepared to do that at all. I believe that if you can't make the deadline, then you should go through the process that was codified when the unitary plan became operative. Good. That's a fair process for Wainui, Belfield and Red Hills to go through. Look, if you look at the Red Hills development area, there is enormous scope now because of the unitary plan that's made operative, not just the SHA site up there at Red Hills, but the whole of that precinct effectively has been made live zoned. The whole of it. I mean, if this SHA becomes operative at Red Hills, well, all of the capacity around that pump station then becomes capacity that could theoretically be used by the whole of the Red Hills precinct. So have we actually got any benefit from that SHA? Probably not. What we've got is we've got infrastructure for a whole live zone precinct at Red Hills. So, Mr Chair, I understand that it's probably, people are treating this as a procedural matter, and they're going to vote, I think, for the extension of the termination date, but I will not, and I'd like my vote against to be recorded. I'm happy to have a division on the matter if need be, if others are of the same mind, but this is not about increasing the supply of housing. Some people might perceive it that way, but I think there are people in the development community and I've got a lot of friends in the development community, but I think there are some people in the development community who are using this to truncate the ability of adjacent property owners to participate in a contested process. And I'm on the side of people who have property rights and who want to debate the impact on them, and I don't think this process of having this housing accord in place is necessarily aiding their cause.
Thank you. Good points. I'd like to just take a note from Councillor Newman's contribution there. I think in our status report for the workshop, I think we should be looking at the name of the applicant when the application came in compared with the current owner of that. It might be the same. Let's have a look if it's different. Because I think there is interest in the on-selling of the SHAs, as Councillor Newman has just highlighted. Can I go now to Councillor Mike Lee?
Thank you, Mr Chairman. I share the concerns of Councillor Newman. I think the idea of special temporary legislation to deal with a crisis is one thing, but when, and the pretext was the existing district plans that everyone has to live under wasn't good enough for the government, and therefore the pretext was we need the special legislation until the unitary plan comes into force. By and large, setting aside one or two appeals, including our own, the unitary plan is operative, and therefore the pretext for the special temporary legislation falls away, or it should do. But no, it's going to be renewed, and that there is the danger now that we will fudge along with continual renewals if we're not careful, which is a very, very bad way to set law and public regulations. I'm concerned that I think we all went along with the idea of special housing areas. We objected to some which were egregiously did not fit the requirements, but by and large the special housing areas were approved by consensus, except for the one that Councillor Casey has talked about, Ihumātao, and also one in Herne Bay at Kilmarna Avenue. Now, my concern is in supporting another extension of this temporary legislation, we are aggravating the negative aspect of this legislation. The positive aspect was it was meant to solve the housing crisis, but you really have to question the sincerity of that when immigration was ramped up at the same time. So, but my real concern is that not only the diminution of public property and civil rights that Councillor Newman has talked about, but also our wider environmental responsibilities under the Resource Management Act, under the, for instance, the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement and the Hauraki Gulf Marine Park Act. Why is this? Because to cover concerns of around infrastructure and the lack of it, the Hash Act, Section 16 said any SHA must have the necessary infrastructure. And that relates to transport, which is always arguable and somewhat flexible, power, schooling and so on, but also in terms of the disposal of stormwater and wastewater. And the special housing area in Herne Bay inadvertently led me into a clash with the Minister himself, because I wrote to him and pointed out that there are already 52 overflows, dry weather overflows and wet weather overflows a year going into Cox's Bay, the Waitemata Harbour. There is special legislation.
I'll just
and I think that
there,
rolling over this legislation, we are being irresponsible in regard to our obligations for the environment. So I'm going to vote against.
Councillor Lee. Just as members, I did indicate that we would examine these SHAs. If you want to go down into detail, we will do that in the workshop. Please front up to the workshop and we will do it in detail. I just want to come back. I'm being a little bit liberal. First meeting, but please look at the motion before us before you speak. And I appreciate a lot of those points, but we were wandering into specifics about individual SHAs. So, look, thank you, Councillor Lee. I don't like cutting people off, but in that instance I did. So I'll now go to Councillor Clow.
Right, I'm going to vote for this, and there's a very specific reason why I'm going to vote for this. Although I'm a little bit disappointed the way the SHAs have worked out, and then we've seemed to have about a third of them dropped away. But for those of you with a conscience around here, remember 10% of the SHAs is for affordable housing. We dropped the affordable housing provision when we adopted the unitary plan. This is our only way at the moment of delivering any affordable housing actually through the SHA. So 10% of all these projects that get up and running are going to help your children or whatever, young people get into housing. So I'm voting for this.
Thank you, Councillor Clow. I'll go to a question from the Deputy Mayor.
Supplementary question to my first one is bearing in mind that this is putting a closure to the SHAs that have already been approved, the last 3, what would happen if this motion was lost today for those 3 developments?
So I'll respond to that. So under the HESHA legislation, you need to be a signatory to a housing accord to actually be the consent authority that administers the qualifying developments. If council does not agree to extend the Auckland Housing Accord, that does not mean that qualifying development applications cannot be made for existing SHAs. What it does mean is that council will not be the consent authority that actually processes those consents. Instead, it reverts to the Ministry for Business, Innovation and Economic, I never remember their whole, but MB. And the view, I suppose, of the staff who have been working on this report is that Auckland Council has well-skilled building consent and resource consent processes. MB does not. So you would be removing the ability of your staff to actually be processing the consents if you do not side up to this extension of the housing accord.
So is that clear, members? So they will progress anyway, but it will be dealt with by a government agency as opposed to our skilled staff. So which would you prefer? And I think that's the fundamental question that we need to be asking ourselves as we prepare to vote. So, Councillor Wayne Walker?
Sure. I've got a particular concern around special housing areas, especially as they go to affordability. The track record is we've had rampant speculation across all of these areas. The consequence is that as far as affordability is concerned, the special housing areas have been a sham. If we're going to have a workshop, if we're going to consider this topic, if we're going to consider any extension of this, and frankly I'd be opposed to it, we need to have some information on that now. And it may be information that the government doesn't want to hear, but we need to hear it, and people in Auckland need to know about it, because we're just not delivering. In fact, these SHAs have done the exact opposite in terms of affordability and in terms of bringing housing on, and they have reinforced the existing land banking that we have in Auckland that is part of the problem.
Okay.
So I'm very reluctant to vote for this, and I may well vote against it for those reasons.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Cooper?
Thank you. Just some questions, and then if I may speak to it, Mr Chairman. So there was just some suggestion by one of the members that council had wasted huge amounts of money on processing these SHAs, that the ones that won't go ahead. And I just wanted to know, my understanding was that the applicant pays the costs of the process. Is that correct?
You want Ms. Pirrett?
That it's fully recoverable?
So in terms of the application process where they go for a plan variation, if they were in areas that were not zoned urban under the unitary plan, or if they go for a qualifying development, yes, the council does recover the cost of that process. I couldn't say they recover 100% of the cost of that process, because we don't do that for
Any, yeah.
any
Yeah.
plan change process, but yes, we do recover costs.
And so if people that applied for an SHA then decided not to do it, it's not inconceivable that people would go ahead and develop that land under the new unitary plan and then have to pay in that regard as well.
Yes, what we have seen in the SHA process is that where land had a live urban zoning, some landowners within an SHA have chosen to use the special process under the Hesher legislation. Some have chosen just to go for consents under the operative plans, and now if they have live zoning under the unitary plan, they can choose either to use the special process or do it just under the normal process.
So really most of the cost goes to the applicant anyway, so you know, some of those concerns around us wasting money are unfounded. I think for me, I'm happy to support this, and because often the very people that are screaming about getting more houses are the people that don't want to vote for this. So it does sort of perplex me somewhat. I mean, this is, and also some of the comments earlier about not enough, not good enough, etc., etc. This is only one tool to use, and it was an interim tool to use until the unitary plan was operative, and so it was a valid thing to do. So for me, we have litigated this over and over during the process, and relitigating it is pointless really, because once this time frame is up, that is it anyway. So so in the workshop, I don't see much point, though it is disappointing that people have got SHA zoning and then on-sold, but that's happened now. There won't be that opportunity again under that kind of situation, but it's no different than people now getting a unitary plan zoning and then on-selling and getting that uplift either. So I don't see much point in us hashing that over in a workshop really, because there's nothing we can do about it, though it is disappointing. For me, we've started this process, some of these, the concerns around saying that people have gone into the SHA process and now they're pulling out, so they will. But the other side of it is that people want to carry on this process. If we don't allow them to do that, there's some really large developments that have done a huge amount of work to get to a certain point, haven't quite met it, and would have to start all over again. And that could actually add to the cost of the houses that they build. So for me, it's going to make affordability even less, more remote if we start to make people start all over again when they've spent probably hundreds of thousands of dollars developing these plans and going through the process. So I will support this because I want those houses delivered. And if some of the allegations about nothing happening, I just had a bike ride down into my old Massey Ward, now Upper Harbour Local Board area a couple of weeks ago, Scott Landing. Every section is sold. The whole thing's ready to go, developed, the curbs, the infrastructure, the whole lot's there. It's ready to go. And, we've got to understand that there is a lead lag time. People have got to get this, everything ready. They've got to get the construction people in there. But these things are happening. And, it doesn't happen overnight. We've only been doing this for not even 3 years, and there's a lot of development going ahead. So I'm really comfortable with it, and I'm also comfortable that there's only one of the levers that we could use. And now we've got a unitary plan, and things will accelerate. I think people are too impatient, to be quite honest. You can't build $400,000 houses overnight.
I have Councillor Fletcher and Simpson. I did say a 12:30 lunch. It is now 5 to 1.
Right.
How about we complete this item and then go to lunch?
Yep.
So hopefully we do that by 1. Councillor Fletcher with a question or comment?
Thank you, Mr Chairman. Mine is a question. I'd like to reserve my speaking rights, if I may. But I want to ask about the consistency of advice that we've received from officers from when the SHAs were first proposed, because of a number of us actually asked a lot of questions, particularly around infrastructure, and sought assurance that the SHA would not be extended beyond the IHP, the unitary plan. So I'm finding it really hard to reconcile today the fact that we're now looking to take it a little bit further out, when I heard very clearly that these would not be sought, extensions would not be sought. So I just want to know from the officers what the view was then and why they see the need for some change on the advice that they're giving us today.
Okay, look, I can go to Ms Pirrett again, but you did hear before that the extension will proceed anyway. It's whether we
I
are
heard
in
that.
control or a government agency is control. I prefer us to be in control with our staff, but Ms Pirrett, you've heard the query again.
So I'm sure the team can elaborate, but if we just need to dial back to around July, I want to say last year, but it's this year. And well, it was even earlier before July, around March this year, the team that deals with the SHA sent out a letter to all existing SHA landowners indicating that in September, on the 15th of September this year, the Hasher legislation would cease to impact on the Auckland area, and that they had only up until then to either lodge their plan variation or their qualifying development. That letter wasn't a requirement of the process, but the council believed it was important to give notice to all the landowners that the end of the special period was coming to an end, as had always been intended by the legislation, because that was when the unitary plan was going to have decisions made and optimistically no appeals. But as a result of that, those landowners actually approached the minister and asked the minister whether he would consider extending the period within which the Hasher legislation would apply. And that is exactly what central government did, is that they did whatever they needed to do to extend the legislation, so it has been extended. It isn't extended for all SHAs, it's for those that were only made SHAs within a defined period. But it was really the central government that made that call. We did put in, I think, feedback on the process, and this is the result of that legislative change, and that in extending the legislation, unless we extend the housing accord, as I've indicated, we are not the consent authority. And so it's not being the consent authority means we cannot process any resource consents or building consents that might come from qualifying developments within those SHAs that have not been extinguished.
Mr Chairman, I understand the answer that we've received from Ms Pirrett, but the question that I put to her was more around the decisions prior to 2013, when at a governance level we gave assurances to a number of people that these would not be extended beyond the life of the unitary plan. So it comes down to a judgment call that we made and the commitments that we made to parties. Now, I understand the spin you've put in it. You want to get, you want to make sure that we've got the steering wheel, if you like, but there are matters of principle here for me. And the issue of principle is that we made a commitment that these would not be extended, and that was the advice that we received at the time. So in order for us to move forward, it's necessary to actually, truthfully, revisit history.
Okay, thank you.
I had a further question.
I've had my question answered, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Newman, do you have a final question?
I do have a final question, Mr Chair, because, and I just want to ask Penny to comment on this, because one of the statements was that if this falls over, these applicants have to go right back to the beginning. Well, we're talking about 3.
No.
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 Oh, sorry. Let's get clear on the number.
You're 3 in your area.
So just,
No,
if we do not, if the council does not agree with the Minister of Housing to extend the termination date of the housing accord, what happens is that those SHAs that have not been extinguished by the extension of the Hasher legislation still have the ability to lodge qualifying development applications, which can either be, well, they're usually both resource consents and building consents. What will be different is that the council no longer has a role as in processing those applications. And that role, for whatever reason, is in the legislation, reverts to MB. And as you would expect, I don't believe MB is that keen on taking on that mantle, because they do not have the technical skills that are necessary to do either resource management assessment or building control assessment. But they can still keep on going for a qualifying development. They can still use the limited notification and the streamlined process until such time as the housing accord, the legislation finishes, which I'd have to revert to the team about when is the final date that they can lodge those.